worst thing you could have told me when I was a kid was that I would spend the rest of my life in school. Guess what? I'm still here. I come with the woodwork, and I'm rather proud to be known as a teacher.
With that backdrop, let's go ahead and hear from Guy Doud speaking to a group of youth leaders on today's Focus on the Family.
Sometimes when I go somewhere to speak, they feel like they need to go on and on and on about how I was chosen National Teacher of the Year and honored at a ceremony at the White House and all of that. And I always get up and say, I really don't have any claim to fame. After I was chosen National Teacher of the Year in 1986-87, a reporter from the USA Today phoned me, a gentleman by the name of Steve Marshall. And he said, Mr. Doud, what does it feel like to have been chosen the best teacher in America? Well, I thought about that a second, and my head began to swell. And then all of a sudden I said, Mr. Marshall, you have to stop right there. In no way does being chosen Teacher of the Year mean I'm the best teacher anywhere. Certainly not in America with 2.5 million teachers. Not in Minnesota or Brainerd, Minnesota, where I teach. Hopefully, I'm the best teacher in my classroom. Sometimes I'm not so sure. But being chosen Teacher of the Year doesn't mean you're the best teacher anywhere. It's simply somebody to speak on behalf of all teachers. And especially with the added, I think, the chance I've had to spread the good news about the Lord Jesus Christ, because that's the most important thing in my life. And I talk about the importance that teachers played in my life because they did. It was a teacher who led me to the Lord Jesus Christ, a public school teacher. And we talk about mission fields. The public schools in America today are great mission fields. And so the public school of America today is a great, great mission field. And as a teacher and as a Christian, I see these kids. And my heart bleeds.
This Focus on the Family broadcast will continue in just a moment.
So I always say I really don't have any claim to fame. If I did have anything at all that people usually think is worthy of some real applause, it's the fact that, I used to weigh over 327 pounds. And I was getting ready to start my second year as a teacher, come into my classroom. It was going to be the first day of teacher workshop the next day, and I had my room all ready to go, And so I went out to eat. And I loved to eat in those days, and I was really heavy and really big. And I went out to Taco Town, which was my favorite haunt at that time. We do have tacos in Minnesota, by the way. Went out to Taco Town, and I had a full order of spaghetti and a half of a chicken, as was my nightly habit. And I was on my way home to have 3 scoops of butterbrickle ice cream, as was also part of my nightly tradition. And I was leaving Taco Town when into the restaurant came this very attractive girl, beautiful girl. She'd been my student. She graduated the previous May. And we ran into each other. I mean, literally. I was trying to leave Taco Town. She was trying to come in. There wasn't room, for both of us in the door. And she kind of bounded off of me, and she said, "Oh, hi, Mr. Doud." Now, I always get really nervous around pretty girls, And so I kind of looked at her and said, "Hi." "Hi, Julie." And she looked at me, she says, "Well, Mr. Doud, are you still teaching?" "Yeah, Julie, just getting ready to start my second year." Why is it kids think that all teachers are ancient, And then she looked at me, she said, "Well, Mr. Doud," she says, "are you married yet?" I said, "No, Julie, I'm not married yet." She says, "Well, Mr. Doud, you'd be kind of cute if you lost 100 pounds. Kind of cute. Why bother? Go through the agony of losing 100 pounds and only be kind of cute? So I went home and had 5 scoops of butter brickle. I got up the next morning and I turned on the Today Show, and Dr. Art Eileen was on with a diet for extremely obese people, and I felt I qualified. And so I wrote it down, started dieting that day, and I lost over 127 pounds, kept it off for 13 years now. Thanks. But you know, when I was really heavy, it really affected my self-esteem, the way I thought about myself. And so I kind of resolved myself to the fact that I was going to be single all my life. And then I lost, 127 pounds, and I noticed that girls started looking at me a little differently. Possibly because I, started looking at them a little differently. I said, well, I've lost over 100. Must be kind of cute. Well, to make a long story short, I finally started going out with this one girl after she asked me out 4 times. I'm sure, we went together for over 3.5 years before I finally got up enough courage to ask her to marry me. The truth is, she'd almost given up on me. And once we decided to get married, I'm old-fashioned. I thought our parents should meet each other and approve of our upcoming nuptials, And so I invited my dad and her mom to my house, and I made my old-fashioned roast beef, potatoes and carrots and gravy dinner. And my girlfriend, Tammy, she brought a pie. And our parents hit it off. They clicked. Unbelievably well they got along together. So Tammy and I were married in June, and our folks were married in August. See, my father was widowed, her mom was divorced, so they got together. We were married in June, our folks were married in August. And if you stop and think about that for a minute, and it takes a minute, that made my father-in-law, my mother-in-law is my stepmother, my wife is my stepsister, and that makes both of our sons our nephews. And just 2 years ago, we had our first niece. And just 2 weeks ago, we found out we have another niece or nephew on the way. Now, there's something you should know about me before I really get into the meat and the potatoes of what I want to talk about tonight. And that is that I am a feeler. When I was in college, we were studying Shakespeare, that old bard from Avon. And I was reading the commentary about Shakespeare's plays, and I remember Walpole writing, he said that with Shakespeare, the world or life is a comedy for those who think. And it's a tragedy for those who feel. Life's a comedy for those who think, a tragedy for those who feel. Now, most of us are a pretty good blend of the two. We're equal thinker, equal feeler. But not me. I am an extreme. I am an extreme feeler. I have heart disease. It breaks very easily. I see things with my heart. And I didn't ask to be this way. In fact, I've spent half my life denying the fact that this is the way I am, because we live in a society where it still isn't acceptable for men to be too overtly emotional, except, of course, in athletic endeavors. But with me, you can tell how I feel a mile away. You can read it on. I'm a feeler. Let me give you an example of that. Oh, commercials. Oh, do you remember that AT&T commercial? You know, where the couple's sitting at the table and the mother looks over at the father and she says, "Johnny called this morning." And he says, "Johnny, what did he call for?" And she says, "Well, he just called to say I love you, Mom." And I watch that commercial. Oh, and then in that Coke commercial, you know, where Mean Joe Green's walking up the football field, you know, and he's got his jersey over his shoulder and he's limping to the line. I mean, he's mean. He's Mean Joe Green. His presence alone is extremely intimidating. And he's limping to the locker room, you know. And here stands this little kid with his bottle of Coke. Here, Mean Joe. Mean Joe grabs the bottle of Coke, you know, and he gulps it down and he empties it out and he hands the empty bottle back to the little kid. And then he turns around, he starts back down the hallway to the locker room and the little kid's watching him go, you know. And all of a sudden Joe stops. The little kid's staring at him. And Joe takes the jersey off his shoulder. And I'm a basket case. But I'm a feeler. So when people have asked me, "Well, Mr. Doud, what do you think about the unions? What do you think about teacher competency testing? What do you think about merit pay? What do you think about career ladders? What do you think? What do you think?" And it's not that I don't think about those things, I do. But I look at these people and I say to them, "Why don't you ask me what I think about kids?" Because I'm in the kid business. And until somebody thrusts some kind of title on me, I have 150 kids a day that walk through those doors and sit in those desks. And every one of them is an individual. And every one of them has a soul. And many of them are hurting. And many of them are lost. And so many of them are searching. And whether we're involved in Christian education or public education or homeschooling, schooling is the only thing today that most of our adolescents have in common. And they go through it during the most vulnerable years of their lives. The vast majority of them come to a classroom like this. And so much of what happens here and what's happening at home is going to determine their lives forever. Yes, forever. And that's why I care so deeply about kids.
This Focus on the Family broadcast will continue in just a moment.
I teach mostly college-bound preparatory students, advanced placement classes. These kids are going to college. They want good ACT or SAT scores. They want tremendous grades, nothing but straight A's. They want big scholarships. They feel the pressure to succeed. They know that education means their ticket to success. I have no trouble at all motivating those students. None whatsoever. They keep me motivated.
But then I'm always given a class or two of fundamentals of composition. The detested, required sophomore grammar, and doesn't the name tell you something? Fundamentals. You know, if you don't make it into sophomore expository, you make it into fundamentals. And a lot of those kids, they love to take notes too. You know, they're drawing marijuana leaves on their notebooks, you know. The greatest challenge I face kids like that is, how do you get them to want to learn? How do you get them to want to put the comma in the right place? How do you get them, the fear of failure doesn't motivate them anymore. Many of them have failed so many times they expect, they've been failing since the day they were born. Somebody asked me not too long ago, well, how's it possible for a kid to fail kindergarten? I said, it's not that impossible when that child has already failed the first 5 years of their lives. And there are a lot of kids who've already failed the first 5 years of their lives because mom and dad have not been there for them. So I do something that some people think is really adventurous. And really wild. I let my students sit wherever they want to sit. The room isn't that big, they can't get too far away from me, And I learn something about my students from where they choose to sit. Where do they see themselves fitting in? Who do they see themselves identifying with? One of the rules of effective communication is know your audience. Where do these kids see themselves? Sean, he always sits by himself. He never talks to anybody else. If you talk to him, you just feel the walls come up immediately. Very quiet young man. Here I am, it's Friday, I'm outside on hall duty, last hour of the day, and here comes Sean. How you doing, Sean? Okay. What are you going to do this weekend? And he looks me right in the eye and he says, I'm going to see my mom. Oh, don't you get to see your mom very often? He says, no. I haven't seen her in 9 years. She deserted us. And suddenly that lesson that I do have planned on split infinitives seems a little less significant. You think of the Seans. And of those kids that come into my classroom, 1 out of every 10 of them come from a chemically dependent home. 1 out of every 13 has been physically or sexually abused. Every 70 seconds in this country, a teenager attempts suicide. Every 90 minutes they succeed. Every 30 seconds an adolescent girl becomes pregnant. No wonder these kids aren't all excited about split infinitives. Sean's aloof, he's not popular, he's not real bright. And we start branding kids. Kids start learning about themselves and where they fit in. I also remember my first year as a teacher, I was sitting in class correcting journals, hoping to get done in time to get to Taco Town and have some spaghetti and chicken. Get to the football game, I'm an avid fan. And I'm sitting at my desk and I look up and there in the doorway is number 85. He's got his jersey on. It's about 5:20 at night. I look up, I say, what are you still doing here? He says, well, I had to pick up some books for the weekend. I kind of like to be the first one to get down in the locker room and get dressed for the game. I said, big game tonight, huh? He says, yeah. I said, we're going to beat them? He says, we're going to kill them. I said, good. Then he kind of stood there and he shifted his weight back and forth from foot to foot. He says, Mr. Doud, tonight's family night. And, at halftime, they have all the senior football players go stand out on the 50-yard line and they have all their parents come and stand behind them. I don't know if you know this or not, but, my folks they're divorced. My dad, he lives in California. My mom, She's out of town. And the coach said that if our folks couldn't be at the game tonight, that we should ask somebody that we respect. Well, I was going to ask you sooner, but hey, if you're not coming to the game tonight, that's okay. And I looked at him and I said, are you asking me to stand up with you at halftime? Well, if you're not coming to the game tonight, that's okay. Well, I am coming to the game tonight. And it would be a tremendous honor for me to stand up with you at halftime. And then he sat down on the edge of a desk, great big relief off his shoulders. He says, you know, I haven't gotten into a game yet this year. And I said, well, what was it a couple weeks ago they introduced you as? He says, yeah, Scout Team Player of the Week. I says, I don't understand that. What does that mean? He says, well, we run the opposition's offense and our defense practices on us. And I said, oh. I said, well, I'm sure you'll get into the game tonight. I'm sure you'll get in tonight. Went to the game that night. I got time to go out to Taco Town and have some spaghetti and chicken. Went to the game and I sat there and I watched number 85. And first quarter ended. He still hadn't made it into the game. Second quarter ended. He still hadn't made it into the game. I remember going out and standing behind him at halftime. And I remember praying a very personal prayer that should I ever have children someday, I prayed to God that they would never have to have a substitute parent. Third quarter started. We maintained quite a considerable lead, but number 85 still hadn't made it into the game. Now, hey, I'm not questioning anybody's coaching decision. I understand how difficult it is to be a coach. I'm a coach. I coach debate and speech, and I have to sometimes decide who gets to go and who doesn't. But, like I said, I'm not questioning the coach. But by the end of the third quarter, I was on my feet. Put number 85 into the game! The game ended and number 85 didn't make it into the game. I remember standing outside on hall duty on Monday, and here he came down the hall, and I said, you guys sure played a great game. He says, yeah. He says, I can't believe that I'm that bad. If they put me in the game, that I had blown the 20-point lead. What did he learn? What did he learn? He learned that despite the fact he'd been to every practice and had spent as much time in the weight room as anybody else, that somebody didn't trust his ability enough to put him in the game. And school teaches kids lots of things like that. I'm in class teaching and there's a knock at the door. It's my world literature class. These are those college-bound prep students I'm telling you about, and there's one girl that's missing, and I go outside, and there she is. Tears streaming down her face. She says, Mr. Doud, she says, I have to talk to you. Well, I'm right in the middle of class. What do I do? I've learned enough over the years not to turn my back on a legitimate cry for help. And I go out with the young girl, and we walk down the hall, and she starts telling me about how she just can't take it anymore, but her stepfather had been visiting her room. And she finally got up enough courage to tell her mother. And her mom says, well, I'll talk to him about it, honey, but don't tell anybody. And all of a sudden, the lesson on Dante's Inferno or Cyrano de Bergerac, it kind of wanes in significance when you got kids that are walking out the door and going home and starting the car up in the garage. Then, you run into these kids, and so many of them seemingly have such obnoxious qualities. And I've come to believe with my whole heart that obnoxious qualities in kids, or in people for that matter, are really just cries for help. Like this one girl, my first year as a teacher. Here I am, I'm teaching contemporary short story, and I want these kids to learn everything I just learned in college. And I found out that, And I found out that there were some kids that weren't all that interested in Faulkner's Yoke Napawatotha County. I couldn't believe it. And there were some kids that weren't that interested in Flannery O'Connor's Southern Gothic style. And there was this, you see, I gave journal assignments, made the kids write in their journal every day, and then I'd correct them. And there was this one girl, she never wrote anything in her journal. Maybe a line here, she was failing. I sent home the referral notices, hoping her parents would get them and give her a good swift kick and motivate her, and she'd come back to class all excited to learn. The truth is, all it did was alienate me more from her. So one Friday I walked into class, and I said, today I want you to write whatever you want to write in your journal. You have all hour to write it. See, I had to get ready for a test the next hour. And I said, the only requirement is that you spend all hour writing. Now, I'm not going to grade these, but if you want to get a mid-trimester grade, you have to do it. So I collected the journals at the end of the hour and went to Taco Town that night and had some spaghetti and chicken, went to the football game, went home, started to read journals. All of a sudden, I pulled out this journal, this girl's, the one that wasn't writing anything. And all of a sudden, here was page after page filled. And she started in, she said, Dear Mr. Doud, I know you don't like me because I'm dumb. But I'm not as dumb as you think I am. You see, last summer, I had an abortion. And then she went on and explained how she was in love with this guy. And she wanted to get married, but her folks wouldn't let her. And then the abortion, and they wouldn't allow her to see her boyfriend. And he moved out of state. And she tried running away from home, and they took her and they put her in a juvenile facility. And here all of a sudden she's writing in her journal. And I'm sitting at home on a Friday night with a bowl of butterbrickle melting, reading this. And she says, if I can't be with my boyfriend, I'd just as soon be dead. And she started listing all the means and methods that she'd considered using for taking her own life.
Thanks for listening to Focus on the Family. Let's resume now with the balance of today's programming.
She started listing all these means and methods she'd considered using for taking her own life. And I'm sitting there on a Friday night, and I'm reading this journal, and I think, my word, for 6 weeks this girl's been sitting 3 feet away from me. And I've been more interested in Flannery O'Connor's Southern Gothic style and trying to shove it down her throat than I really ever have been about her. And it reconfirmed something for me, that there's something even more important than reading and writing and arithmetic. Something even more important than computer literacy. I teach human beings. And as a Christian, I have a responsibility. I remember back to my college days, when one day during final exams, I was bummed out. I'd been up for nights on end and felt the pressure to get good grades, and I took off, and what I did when I felt that way is I would eat. I went downtown Fargo, North Dakota, sat in a restaurant right on Main Street, and I ordered the biggest breakfast you could find. and I started to eat. And as I was eating, along came these two people that had to be the grossest looking people I'd ever seen in my whole life. They must have been let out of a day center or something, just deformed faces. And they came into the restaurant and they ended up sitting right next to me. And they were turning me off. And I couldn't stand looking at them. I know it's a terrible way to feel, but I felt that way. I can't deny it. And not long after, along the street came this mother with her little daughter, beautiful, blonde-haired little girl. And they came into the restaurant. And this deformed-looking old lady with this huge cauliflower ear and these growths on her face, she said, "Oh, look at that beautiful little girl." And the old lady said, "Come here, honey. Come here. Give me a kiss." I wanted to jump out of my seat. I wanted to say, how could you ask her to kiss that? And the little girl looked up at her mommy, and her mommy smiled at her. And the little girl went over to this lady, and she put her hands right on her face, and she leaned up to her and kissed her. And then she backed up and she said, "Jesus loves you." And I went back to my dorm room, and my roommate had a poster on the wall. This old drunken bum in the gutter, his flask empty, passed out, drunken old bum. And the poster read, "You love Jesus Christ only as much as the person you love the least." So you know what I do as a teacher? I go to school a little early in the morning. Here's a desk. Here's where Sean sits. I sit down in Sean's desk, and I pray for Sean, sitting in his desk. And then when Sean comes walking down the hall, I can never think of him again in the same way.
What a caring approach to teaching from Guy Doud. And we're going to hear where he learned the importance of that kind of empathy on today's Focus on the Family.
First thing I learned in school that I was fat. Didn't know that till I started school. My whole family was fat. And then I started school and I found out that I was the brunt of jokes. And then it was pick sides for recess. Remember that? Joe and Steve, they were always the captains, and I was always picked last. How come? I wasn't that bad at kickball. Yeah, I couldn't run very fast after I kicked it, but if you kicked it to me, buddy, I sure could suck it in. And you know what I took that to mean? I took it to mean not only that I wasn't any good at kickball, but I took it to mean that I wasn't any good. And nobody wanted me on their team. Oh, and then, you know, another very important lesson I learned. I came with my box of 6 Crayolas. I was proud to have them. That was something to have a box of 6 Crayolas, and here comes the little mayor's daughter with a box of 64 variety and a built-in sharpener on the back end. You know, and I learned where I fit in on the social economic ladder. You know, get up for recess, tell what you did over Christmas vacation. So I get up there really proud to do it. Well, you know, my grandma and grandpa, they lived 2 blocks that way, you know, and my mom and dad, they lived 6 blocks. We went to Grandpa and Grandma's house, and Grandma made a big turkey and ham, and my mom, she brought some homemade pie, and then we went outside sliding. And the teacher says, "Well, thanks, Guy. You can sit down." Who else? And then up steps the little mayor's daughter. "What I did on Christmas vacation. We flew to the Bahamas. The Bahamas. I grew up in central Minnesota, Lake Wobegon, you know. And the furthest I'd ever been away from home was Wadena, 17 miles away. My grandpa took me there to see the zoo. We saw a goat. And that goat is still the main exhibit at the Wadena Zoo. You know, but I started learning these things. And then artwork, wonderful artwork. I remember the teacher, she came into class, she says, today we're going to make gingerbread men, and I want you to make a gingerbread man like my gingerbread man. She says, but you may not use your scissors. I thought, how come? I got a perfectly good pair of scissors in my desk. You must use only your hands. And I have problems with that because my hands don't work very well. This one here in particular locks and it doesn't want to bend. Anyhow, my gingerbread, you know that we had that little white pasty glue? And I could never keep it on the back side of whatever it was I was gluing. It was always ended up smeared all over the front. I'd get it in my hair, on my face, all over my sweater. I'd go home covered with white pasty glue, you know. Well, my gingerbread man ended up looking pathetic. So the teacher put the good ones up on the bulletin board above the blackboard, but not my gingerbread man. Mine and Marilyn Comedics were the only two that didn't make it up there. So then my mom came for open house, and while she was waiting to talk to the teacher who was talking to some other parents, my mom was looking around the classroom, and she says, oh, honey, she said, which gingerbread man's yours? Mine isn't up there. Well, how come? Didn't you make one? Yeah, I made one. Well, how come yours isn't up there? Guess they didn't have enough room up there. So, what, do you have yours? And I said, sure. So I walked over to my desk and I lifted up the lid of my desk. Oh, my desk was a mess. And every marking period, my elementary teacher under neatness would check, needs improvement. And she'd write in, needs to keep a clean desk, exclamation point. Hey, you elementary teachers, you should see my desk today. It's still a mess. That's because I'm an abstract random. And I reached down into my desk and I pulled out my gingerbread man and I took it over and I gave it to my mom. And she looked at it. She said, oh, honey, she says, that's beautiful. And she took it home and she put it up. Guess where she put it? You do that here, too, huh? Federal law. The kid brings something home, it goes on the refrigerator. But you know what? I took that to mean not only that I wasn't any good at making gingerbread men, but I wasn't any good. And I learned all these things about myself. Why was it in first grade I could have already told you who the homecoming king and queen were going to be? We had them all identified. And I knew that I wasn't one of the popular kids. I didn't like school much. And I thought, well, you know, my dad didn't finish school. I might as well quit school. I hated school. And then in sixth grade, something pretty significant happened. Never forget. Although I didn't like school, I was the first one there the first morning of sixth grade. And I showed up, I walked into the room, and there was a man in the room. I'd never seen a man in our building before except Mr. Hill and Mr. Lindman, the janitors, but this guy wasn't a janitor, he had a tie on. But he looked far too young to be a teacher. He couldn't have been more than 80 or 90. And he came right over to me, he says, hi there. He said, I'm Norm Card, Mr. Card. I'm going to be your teacher. And he held out his hand. I'd never had a teacher hold out his hand to me before. So I held out my hand and he shook it. He says, what's your name? Guy Doud. He says, "Oh, I've heard about you." I thought, "Oh no. You've probably heard that I am no good at reading." That's not true. I just don't like them SRA boxes. But you know, Mr. Card, he didn't seem to care what he'd heard about me. He seemed to treat me as if I was really important. And I remember sitting in my desk, and I remember him coming by my desk, and I remember him putting his hand on my shoulder. And I hated it. And I loved it. All at the same time. And his hand weighed a ton. Oh, and then Mr. Card, when we'd go outside for recess, he wouldn't let us pick the teams. He picked the teams. The only trouble was he was a ball hog, and he always had to be the quarterback. And I'll never forget the day that I was on Mr. Card's team, and we were in the huddle, and he says, "Guy," he says, "I want you to go out for the pass. I want you to go down the left side. I want you to cut across. When you're cutting across, I'm going to hit you with the bomb." I couldn't believe it. He was going to throw the ball to me. To me. All I'd ever been told to do before was block. So here I am, my whole heart is just a bump-a-da, bump-a-da, bump-a-da. And I go running out, you know, for the pass. And here's Mr. Card. He's as elusive in the backfield as Fran Tarkenton ever was, you know. Here I start my cut across. Here comes Mr. Card. Here comes the pass, and I jump up, and I got it. And it was the greatest moment of my life. And I was touched immediately, because I couldn't run very fast. It's just lucky for those other kids that it was touch football. Because they never would have brought me down. But you know, Mr. Card seemed to like me, and so I worked hard for Mr. Card. And you know what? I don't remember one thing he taught me. Oh, I'm sure he did, but I don't remember one thing about history or reading or math or geography. I don't remember one thing he taught me, but I still remember him coming to class and telling us that he and his wife are going to have their first baby any day. And I remember when his son was born, and he brought Randy to school. And I said, "You know, Mr. Card, I got a baby brother at home, Mr. Card, and I change his diapers a lot, so if you need some help changing Randy's diapers, just let me know." About 20 minutes later, he says, "Guy, come on up here." Mr. Card was great. And you see, he was that male role model in my life that I so desperately needed. And I'd listen to him talk about going hunting. And I thought, oh boy, if I could have a big brother or a dad like Mr. Card. The last week, Mr. Card came in, and he sat down on the edge of his desk, and he looked at all of us. He says, "You know, this was my first year as a teacher. And you're the first class I've ever had. So you're really special to me. And I'm always going to remember you. So I've taken all your pictures and I've put them in this scrapbook. And I'm going to pass it around. And I'd like you to find your picture, and when you do, I'd like you to write me a little note, because I always want to remember you." And when they welcomed me home from the White House, they had a big ceremony, and the governor of Minnesota and his wife was there, and our commissioner of education was there, and my superintendent and school board and principal and all these dignitaries. And I looked all the way down toward the end of the line. There was Mr. Card with his red scrapbook under his arm. And I ran right down and I gave him a hug. And he says, kind of shook it off. Remember this guy? And he opened up his scrapbook, and here's a picture of this fat, bald-headed kid. I was always bald because my dad always said, you don't need to go to the barber's, and he just took a shear. And I looked at this fat, bald-headed kid, and I'd written, Dear Mr. Card, thank you for being so nice to me. Guy Doud. I didn't want to leave 6th grade. I'd heard about 7th. I knew that I had to leave my little Lincoln Elementary School that was so safe for me now. And I had to go all the way across town to the big junior, senior high school with grades 7 through 12, all in the same building, and a vocational school attached besides. And I had to have a locker. And I had to have 7 different classes and 7 different teachers, and I had to have different books for each class. And I had to remember my combination. And one of the classes that I had to take was gym class. I'll tell you right now, I don't like to run. I only run when I'm being chased. And I'd heard about gym class. It wasn't like recess in elementary. In elementary, you just went right outside with whatever clothes you'd wore into school. But in gym class, you had to undress. You had to get naked. All my life, Mom had said, Guy, hold your stomach in. And I'd become good at holding it in. And all of a sudden, everything I'd been holding in was going to be exposed for the whole world to see. I was a nervous wreck. I remember lying awake all night thinking, oh, I got to take gym class. I got to take gym class. I got to take gym class. Finally, a letter came home from the school. If you have a son in gym class, this is what he will need. Staples Cardinals, red and white, dynamite. Onward, Cardinals, to victory. We're behind you in this fray. Gonna need a pair of white gym shoes, white gym socks, red gym shorts, that other thing, and a white t-shirt. Well, we didn't have any of those things, so Mom went to Batcher's department store and bought those things for me. Finally, that first day of gym class came. That long, dreaded day came. And to make matters even worse, I had a gym teacher who had just gone back into teaching after finishing 20 years in the Marines as a drill instructor. That's the truth. He'd heard about us 7th graders, and by golly, we weren't going to get the best of him. He came into class that first day, said, all right, listen up. I am going to issue you a lock. I am going to give you the combination to your lock. Should you forget the combination to your lock, I'm going to write it across your forehead in magic markers. Understood? And guess who forgot the combination? He said, all right, you're changing your gym clothes on the double. Well, here I am reaching. I didn't need to go run laps. The sweat was just pouring out of me. I mean, I was perspiring rivers. And so here I am reaching in my bag, taking out my shoes and my shorts and my socks and my shirt. And that other thing. You know, I'd never seen one of those before. It said bike on the box. I took it out, I looked at it, didn't look anything like a bike. Looked more like a slingshot. world should I do with this thing? Should have played with it at home or something. I was too embarrassed to look over at Steve and see how he was putting his on. And it didn't do any good to look down. I couldn't even see my feet. So here I am holding this thing. Well, you know what I did? I did something that I think is extremely logical. I decided to tie in to previous learning experiences. The tags on things, well, they always go in the back. How do you girls know about that? Well, I no more than had it on. I knew something was wrong. So now I'm looking over at Steve. Oh, that's how it goes. Well, I was too embarrassed to take it all the way off and call even more attention to myself. So I thought maybe I could just twist it around. Okay, go ahead and laugh. So here I am trying to twist it around when all of a sudden my gym teacher sees me. Look at this. Look at this, everybody. He doesn't even know how to put on a jock strap. And everybody looked. And everybody laughed. And you know, down deep inside, there's still a little part of me that still hurts. I remember making it through that hour of gym class. I was the last one back in the locker room. I remember having to take a shower. And the worst thing about it was I had to take it naked. And I remember as I stood there taking my shower, I felt my face getting hotter and hotter and my stomach churning, and I was sick. And I had to go home sick. And I missed the next couple weeks of school sick. And I had gym class on Tuesdays and Thursdays and every other Friday. And I was sick an awful lot on Tuesdays and Thursdays and every other Friday. And I wanted to quit school. I wanted to quit because all I'd learned is that I wasn't good at anything. The only time I was good at anything was on Saturdays and Sundays, like playing King on the Mountain in the neighborhood. Nobody could get me off the mountain. But then I ran into a gal by the name of Mrs. Morey. She was my 7th grade English teacher, and I didn't particularly like her class either. We were studying Greek mythology. And I thought, what do these Greek gods and goddesses have to do with anything anyhow? But you know, Mrs. Morey, she seemed to have this idea that it was her job to teach me. She seemed to have this idea that if I failed, she failed. She wasn't going to give up on me. She made me stay after school. And I remember sitting there wondering what she wanted now, and she came into class and she said, Guy, when I called on you to read today, you read with a great deal of expression and feeling. Do you like to read? Yeah. Well, what do you read, Guy? Books. Well, what kind of books? Well, I read the Babe Ruth story, Jackie Robinson story, Joe DiMaggio's story, Warren Spahn's story, Al Kaline's story, Stan Musial's story, Harmon Killeber's story. She says, you like baseball. Very perceptive lady, Mrs. Moore. And I said, yeah, I want to be a big league ball player when I grow up. She says, just a minute. And she walked over to her file cabinet and she went through it. And she came back with something in her hand. She says, would you read this for me? said, sure. So I started to read it. She says, I want you to read it out loud. I says, oh. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2, but with 1 inning left to play. So when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. And I went on. And she says, Guy, that's great. I'd sure love to have you on our school speech team. I says, well, what does that mean? She says, well, we go to speech meets on Saturdays. And I thought, ooh, that's one of the only days I'm good at anything. Well, I joined the speech team, and I made it all the way to the state tournament. And I remember Mrs. Morey calling me up on stage at the end of the year and giving me an award. And as we walked off, she put her arm around me, and she says, now this summer you're going to have to work on your speech for next year. And I thought, you mean I have to wait all summer long before I get to be in speech again? I had my speech found and memorized by the 1st of June. You wouldn't have wanted to come to our house that summer. You would have been fair game. But you know, speech wasn't until the spring of the year. So in the fall of the year, I got involved in choir, safety patrol, library, helper. Oh, and then my 8th grade gym teacher. He was a super guy. Super. He was fatter than I was. And I'd struggle to do a pull-up, and I couldn't do one. You know, you just pat me on the butt. He'd say, good effort, Guy, good effort. Because he couldn't do one either. And he says, Guy, I need somebody to help manage the junior high football team. Well, I became manager of the junior high football team, the basketball team, the track team. Went on to become senior high manager, lettered in all 3 sports. I got roles in the plays, National Thespian Society, Quill and Scroll, because I was the editor of the school paper and the school yearbook. And in 8th grade, I had a teacher, yes, in the public school, a man by the name of Heinrich Kopka. Mr. Kopka was my 8th grade math teacher and 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade German teacher. He'd been a missionary to New Guinea. And Mr. Kopka discipled me. He knew that the public school was not a place where he could openly proselytize, but nothing prevented him from living out his faith. I learned a poem that applies to Mr. Kopka. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather have you walk with me than merely point the way. The eye is a more ready pupil than ever was the ear. Good advice is often confusing, but example is always clear. One of my heroes, Apostle Paul, writes to the church in Corinth in his 2nd letter, in the 3rd chapter, he says, do you realize that your life is a letter that's being read by everybody? And it's a letter that isn't written in ink, but it's a letter that is written by the Holy Spirit on the tablet of a human heart. Your life's a letter, Mom. Your life's a letter, Dad. You teachers, your life's a letter. And Mr. Kopka cared enough to come to my home. And Mr. Kopka cared enough to ask my parents if I could go with him to a gospel concert. And Mr. Kopka cared enough to invite me to a Billy Graham movie. And I sat there watching that movie, The Restless Ones, and I said, boy, I sure don't have anything in common with those motorcycle kids. And as the movie went on, I realized I was just as lost, just as much of a sinner, and just as much in need of Christ's saving grace. And I got up at the end of that movie and gave my life to Jesus Christ because of a public school teacher. I got so involved in school, my grades went from the bottom to the top. I ran for student council every year, never got elected. But my principal always appointed me member at large. I never realized the significance of it at that time. And when I was a senior, I was elected president of the Future Teachers of America Club. And in Little Staples High School, with just about 125 kids in each grade, we had about 90 students, grades 10 through 12, in Future Teachers of America. And I remember thinking, boy, if I could be a teacher like Mr. Card, if I could be a teacher like Mrs. Roberts, like Mrs. Morey, like Mrs. Miller, like Mr. Kopka, if I could be a teacher. And on April 14th, 1986, I had the unbelievable honor of being invited into the Oval Office to meet the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, on behalf of all of America's teachers. He kept me waiting over an hour and a half. And when my wife and I were finally showing in, the first thing I said to him was, I said, "Sir, I do not appreciate being kept waiting." That's a lie. And as we came into the office, he held out his hand. "Saw you on Good Morning America this morning." That impressed me because I'd read that he didn't get up quite that early. And then he quoted me. He said, "You know, when you said that you don't teach English or speech or world literature, but you teach students, you teach kids." Well, that reminded me of some of those teachers I had when I was growing up. And then he reached into the vest pocket of his coat and he pulled out a piece of his individualized note card stationery, gold embossed presidential seal, his name across the top, about the size of a postcard. And he said, "I came across this poem a number of years ago, back in my Iowa days. It's by Clark Mollenhoff, who was a journalist for the Des Moines Register. And better than anything else I've ever read, it explains just how important all you people are who work with kids, you teachers. And well, if you don't mind, I'd like to read it to you." And I said, "Oh, go ahead."
This Focus on the Family broadcast will continue in just a moment.
And the president looked at me, he says, "This poem summarizes better than anything I've ever read how important teachers are in helping mold the lives of kids. And I'd like to read it for you." And he looked at me and he said, "Teachers, and I hope you include yourselves, you are the molders of their dreams. The gods, little g, who build or crush their young beliefs of right or wrong. You are the spark that sets aflame the poet's hand or lights the flame of some great singer's song. You are the God of the young, the very young. You are the guardian of a million dreams. Your every smile or frown can heal or pierce a heart. Yours are 100 lives, 1,000 lives. Yours the pride of loving them, and the sorrow too. Your patient work, your touch, make you the gods of hope who fill their souls with dreams to make those dreams come true. And when he was finished reading it, our eyes met and there were tears coming down my cheeks. The president had big tears in his eyes. Very warm, personable man. And he looked at me and he says, well, if you don't mind my chicken scratches, I wrote this off in kind of a hurry. You can have this. His own handwriting. And I took it and I held it. I stared at it. His own handwriting. And I'd read 2 weeks earlier, his signature alone was worth $66. So I started counting up the words, On a teacher's salary, you'd do the same thing on a youth minister's salary. But the Apostle Paul writes that our life is a letter that people are reading. And these people would rather see a sermon than hear one any day. And they look to each of us, and each of us has the potential to be that molder of dreams. Thank you for what you do. God bless you, you molders of dreams.
Teacher of the Year, Guy Doud, on today's edition of Focus on the Family.